going to talk about methodology that went behind this research. So, first of all, I'm going to reiterate a little bit about the aims of the work. And as Simon said, as the trade association that represents the professional installers and manufacturers of CCTV equipment and systems in the UK, the BSIA has been well aware for a long time about sort of statistical relationships of the number of cameras which are publicly owned, privately owned, and roughly where they would be. But if we want to project that information into public perception, it's no good us just saying, well, we know it's like that. We needed to have some research that actually put some figures behind that so that we could use that in any arguments. And so that's where we were looking at the differences, and in particular we're looking at this issue of publicly owned versus privately owned cameras. A lot of people who are worried about CCTV are thinking about public space as in your local high street or something like that, and that is an area where people are seeking regulation. But then you get statistics about cameras and you start thinking about where are the other cameras and so on. So that was our objective in doing this research, was to come up with figures for where you would find cameras. One of the issues is that at present there is no requirement to register cameras. There's no registration for cameras. There is registration of CCTV systems in many cases under the Information Commissioner's Office requirements, but they apply to the system operators. So the operator of a system has to register it if it's observing public space, but they do not have to register every single camera. So there's no registration that we could use to obtain the figures. By doing this research, we hope we'd be in a position where we can state not just a total, but also to highlight what types of property you can find cameras in. So, without further ado, first thing to think about is what's included in our estimates. You will hear other figures. People will quote different figures for things, and there are other estimates out there for CCTV systems. And it's very interesting when you look at them to compare what they have included in the numbers, because that is one of the reasons why you will get different figures from different people. So what we're looking at is our estimate is intended to include any camera that's used for security purposes. Now, we're aware that there will be cameras which are in public space, private space, and they can be remotely monitored or recorded or not. There's a whole variety of uses. We're not limiting the count to in any respect for those. From our point of view, it's going to be used for security, whether it's inside a building, outside a building, and the other issue we've got is this issue of public space. It's very difficult to come up with a strict definition of what is public space. Is public space an area that has unlimited free access by the public, or is it an area that the public sometimes enter? It's very difficult to go into that, and that was one of the reasons why we have not particularly concentrated on looking at the details of that. But there is some discussion of that in the report. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of cameras are recorded, and that has an effect on the number of cameras that are fitted. If you imagine that the number of cameras that are, if a camera is being recorded but not watched continuously, then it's in a fixed position. So to watch more places, you need more cameras. If it's being monitored continuously by an operator, then they can move it around, and then you might need fewer cameras. We've not included things that you may be aware of, dummy cameras. There are things that look like cameras but are not actually recording images. They're not included. Our interest is in cameras which are setting up for security purposes, used to detect crime, act as a deterrent, and provide evidence after an event. We're not looking at things like the traffic master system, watching the motorways and that sort of thing. In practice, there are some cameras that we couldn't include in the research. The main one of those that you will probably be interested in is householders, private householders. The problem with those is, to the large extent, if you look at the way we did the research, then the proportion of cameras that would be associated with private houses is very small, and it would be very difficult to give a reliable statistic. So at the moment, they're not included. And finally, I'm just pointing out on there that the estimate is of cameras, not systems. So a system could have 1 or 2 cameras, it could have 50 cameras. But our count is of cameras, not of systems. Finally, in terms of what the estimate includes, we're looking at here, we're talking about the whole of the UK. So we're looking at England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. We wanted to include the whole of the UK, but the method that I'll show you in a moment uses government statistics to obtain the results, and each of those areas produces different statistics which cannot be related to each other in an exact manner. So for the overall figures that we're giving, we cannot give precise matching figures for each of those areas. In the predominant number of the estimations we're giving are based on the England and Wales figures, and then we've had to extrapolate. We may, in future, be able to take some of the areas of work and produce better figures for those by using what we can, alternative methods to produce better results for each of the individual areas, but that will be in the future. So, first of all, I'm going to talk about the principles of how we did this. So the basic thing is the fact that we didn't want to rely on, as Simon suggested, taking an area, looking at the number of cameras and extrapolating. What we're interested in is where they are used. And to do that, we wanted to break down all of the properties into a categorisation of the number of different properties. So, for example, we could be looking at restaurants, petrol stations, leisure centres, that sort of thing. We're then going to find some government-based or public official figures that we can use as the basis for counting, some form of information that we can relate to cameras that we're going to source. And as you can see out there, there's a suggestion that it could be the count of the number of properties, it could be the floor area of the properties, it could be the number of people associated with the properties. Some relationship of properties that we can use linked to cameras. We're then going to combine information from our members and some others in the industry which we've obtained by survey results. So we're using the professional people who know what they're doing when it comes to how many cameras are used in those types of property, combining those with some analysis and assessment to check that it makes sense, and then we put it all together and we perform a calculation. So to go through one of the methods, because it's not restricted, there's several methods described in the report, but this is the basic one that we started with on our first stab at getting some results. So basically, as I said, we divided up into a number of categories, and let's say we're talking about schools. So we take our category, and for each category, we say to our members and their associates, if you're going to fit cameras in schools, how many cameras are you likely to fit in a typical school? And so we get a number, and that's the number C up there, number of cameras. And then we say, on a survey, what proportion of schools will actually have cameras? Some schools might not have any cameras, a lot of schools may. What proportion of them will? And then we do this for every category. And then we take some official figures, like the base information we use came from the Valuation Office Agency. It's the figures used by the government for when they're working out the business rates values. So they do a count of properties and they publish those. And that was our base starting point. And then from that, we can multiply those figures together and we end up with a total. So our total at the bottom there, the end figure, is the total estimate for that type of property. So, using the example of schools, here are some numbers. We've got some government figures, say there are 26,000, nearly 27,000 schools. We've got our survey results, so that's taking into account how many cameras in a typical property and what percentage of the properties will have cameras. Put them together and we end up with a figure of 12.4. So that's 12.4 cameras per school, that's what we're saying. And then you multiply the two together and we end up with a figure of 330,000. Now, what we have to say is, we know that if we just ask a number of people for an estimate, they're going to give us different figures. People work in different types of property, different areas of the country, they'll be dealing in all sorts of different arrangements, and those people will all give different answers to the question. So, rather than be too fixed in what we're looking at, because we can't be absolutely certain whether we're right or wrong, we actually allowed within those values for a range. Now obviously for each property type there was going to be a different range, but what we've come up with is a minimum and a maximum, we call it a high and a low figure. So we're looking at, for schools in this case, a low range estimate of 291,000 and a high range of 374,000. I'll work remembering that because we'll come back to that later. Now, there's problems with doing that. And this is where the research started to get a little bit more complicated and delayed us coming up with an answer. So, let's say I'm sending out a survey to installers of CCTV systems. So I say, how many cameras are going to fit in an office? And the first person looks at it and thinks of an office that looks like this. And the second person looks at it and thinks of an office that looks like that. And the third one thinks of an office that looks like that. You're going to get a totally different figure. They're not thinking in the same way. So we needed some alternative way. So I mentioned earlier using different government figures, and in this case what we did was we carried out a second set of research and based our estimate on the floor area. So we'd say, we show a whole set of pictures, I think there were 15 pictures or something, they're all in the report, you can have a look at them, and say, how many cameras would you fit in all of these? And then, using a rather complicated method that I won't go into now, but is explained in the report, you can then relate the number of cameras to a sort of 10,000 square metres of floor area will typically have that number of cameras for offices, for factories, and so on. And you can see how it works out in the report. So that gives us, this is just a couple of methods we've used, and if you look at the report, you can see some of them. Now, this is where I have to start going into cautions. Obviously, this is still an estimate, and in any case there can be errors, and I suggested about the fact that we allow for some tolerance. But even then, there could be some big margins of error. An example, our survey came up with the fact that the average number of cameras in a pub is 10.5. And I said that this is pubs and pub restaurants and so on, it's not just, it's a wider category than you might first think. But what if that's not quite true? What if our installers didn't, maybe all the ones we spoke to mainly dealt with city centre pubs. Maybe they'd never been to rural areas of the country which didn't require so many, and maybe if we actually got a better value it might only be 5. I'm not saying it is. That could affect the total number of cameras in pubs by a figure of 300,000 cameras, which is a significant amount. So that's one of the cautions, because each of the values that go into the equation can end up with an error. Another cause of an error is those official figures. That sounds good to start with. You say, well, how many schools are there? You start looking around for official figures and how many schools, and suddenly we discover that actually I came across 4 different figures for the number of schools. Is it 22,000? Is it 29,000? I can't be certain, I'm not going to go and count every one. And that means simply on those variations we end up with a variation in that estimate of 84,000. So This is just to throw some caution into the figures. What we hope to do over time is obviously narrow down some of these. There will be some areas where people have got some interest and they're likely to come back to us. We would hope to reduce these areas. So, as Simon's alluded to the fact, and I'm quite sure that everybody's going to be interested to know, what if you add all these numbers together? What do we end up with? Simon mentioned the 4.2 or 1.85 billion. What do we think it is? So, I mentioned before that for each of the individual estimates we've got a low, a middle and a high range. And what obviously we can do is we can add all of the low range numbers up, all of the middle, all of the high. Now if you think about this, it's unlikely to make sense that the high range figure is going to be correct in all cases. And it's equally unlikely that the low range figure is going to be correct in all cases. The chances are it's going to be a mixture. It'll be some on the verging towards the high side and some towards the low side. But what we can obtain is these sums, and the figure we would most likely to quote is the one that's going to be roughly in the middle. It may be either side. So these are the figures that we come out of this with. So middle range is 4.9, about 5 million, and but it could be low as 4, as high as 5.9. There's quite a tolerance in there, and we over time we might try to lower.